In my senior year of high school, I dated a guy that we'll call Tom for the sake of this story. We dated for over a year, and the relationship was not good. We were always breaking up and getting back together, fighting, and he would threaten me a lot. It was just overall toxic. His parents also had a very rocky relationship. His dad was an alcoholic and beat on his mom most nights. I even witnessed it when I spent the night there on a rare occasion. It was scary. Towards the end of senior year, Tom cheated on me at his birthday party, so again we broke up. Then months later we tried to get back together again, but I realized I just didn't like him anymore and called it quits for good. That was 15 years ago, and the last time I saw him, I've since heard he became an alcoholic, just like his dad, became very violent, and wound up in a mental hospital. I wasn't sure of the details, but had heard he might be schizophrenic. 9 years ago, I met my now husband, and we've been married for 4 years and have a 2-year-old, and another one on the way. When maybe about a year ago now, I got a random text message that read, "Sarah?" Now I get work calls and texts on my personal phone, so I answered with a "yes." Then in response they wrote, "How are you?" I should mention here that I've had the same number since high school. I didn't respond because I didn't know who it was, and at this point figured it wasn't something having to do with work. Then a few minutes later I got another text saying it was from Tom and asking how I was again. I gasped. I responded saying I was well and hoped he was too, and he asked what I was doing. Again I didn't respond. Then a minute later he asked, "Do you ever think about us or wondered what could have happened if we were still together? Do you ever think about getting back together?" I sat in silence rereading these messages, unsure of how to respond. Eventually I replied to say that I was sorry, but no. I'm married now and wished him the best, but said that I didn't think that we should have any form of communication. He responded by saying, "Okay, sorry." I thought this was weird, but whatever. Maybe the dude is lonely and decided to reach out. Who knows? And that was that. However, last week his mother showed up at my family business where I've worked since high school in different roles. She and his father had gotten a divorce and she now has a boyfriend that she seems happy with. We exchanged pleasantries and then she asked, "Did you hear about Tom? He was in an institution." I said that I'd heard that and I was sorry, but then she continued to tell me that he'd killed several animals and that's why he ended up there. Wow. Again, I said I was sorry to hear it, when she said, "Yeah, but he's out now. Has been for a while. You know, you were always my favorite girlfriend of his. Do you ever still think about him?" I wasn't sure what to say to this. I wanted to say, "Lady, that was in high school. No." But instead I said, "No, I'm married now with a toddler, so I don't have much time to think about anything. Trying to lighten the mood, I guess." She then said, "You know he's not a bad guy. I don't see him that much anymore. But when I do, he still talks about you. He wonders what could have been. Would you ever be open to talking to him again?" That's when I shut things down and told her it was great to see her, but that option was off the table now and forever. I said I had to get back to work, then walked away and hid in the back until she left. What the actual hell? This high school relationship was years ago, and I want no part of him or his family. I'm just so sincerely hoping he doesn't pop up at my place of work. I have no idea if he's still around the area, but I really, really hope he isn't. Anyway, bizarre old high school boyfriend. Let's not meet again. I just read another user's story about the smiling man at the laundromat, and it instantly transported me back to a similar high school memory. I was about 15 or 16, and my older brother, that went to the same high school as me, would drive us to school most days of the week, when our parents stopped wanting to get up early, since we both had zero period that began at 7 a.m. One day on the way to school, we stopped at a donut shop that was in a sort of remote part of town on a stretch of highway, and it was still kind of dark outside, being before 6:30 a.m. This was in the late 90s or early 2000s, before it was common for teenagers to have their own cell phones, so I didn't have a way to call or text. This shop had nothing around it, except trees and a stretch of empty land. The parking lot was too big for how small this place was, but he didn't park us in the very front spot by the door, and to this day I have no idea why he didn't. He parked about a row and a half from the front and walked in. No one was at the counter, so I watched him wait for service, and while he was waiting, my eyes wandered and panned around, suddenly coming across to a man's face staring daggers at me from one of the tables in the shop. It was very startling, like in movies when they look through binoculars and see someone staring at them through the scope. I immediately looked away and down because it really freaked me out, and at first I thought maybe the man was tired and was just kind of spacing out because of how early it was, but I still felt his eyes on me after a few minutes, and although I fought myself to look up, I glanced up and he had a creepy smile on his face. He had short bobbed hair like a dude would have in the 70s. Then I looked at my brother and it felt like an eternity as he picked the donuts. He had turned around once and I tried to get his attention, but he turned back around to keep choosing. When my brother was talking to the cashier, I noticed the man at the table get up. He never took his eyes off me, and I remember my heart beating hard in my chest as I looked down, as I couldn't think of anything else to do. This is how I was reminded of this memory from the other post. The feeling of helplessness when someone is staring and making you uncomfortable. I hoped he would just walk away, but at the corner of my eye I noticed he was approaching the truck. My first thought was to reach over and honk the horn as loudly as I could, but he was already about one stride away from the driver's door, and it was right then I had noticed the door hadn't auto-locked. It was the kind that had the little pop-up button lock, and I had only seconds to choose to lock the door or honk the horn. So I practically leapt over, and I remember slapping down the lock button. Not but 2 or 3 seconds later, the man pulled on the door handle, then turned to walk away, but then turned again and tried to pull harder. I then honked the horn to get attention, but I saw my brother had walked to the other side of the counter out of view. After I honked a second time, the guy walked off past the car and across the street, where it was a bit wooded before the highway resumed. When my brother came back, he asked why I was honking and being impatient, because it was still early and we wouldn't be late. And after I told him some creep had tried to get in, he drove around the area, but no one was around since it had been 5 more minutes before he'd got to the car. Creepy, smiley, zoned out donut shop guy. Let's not meet. I'm a 24-year-old female and have moved into my first apartment by myself. I usually have roommates, but during my last situation I was sexually harassed by 2 guys in my house, and also by a 60-year-old woman who was a severe alcoholic and drug addict. So long story short, I've been here for 2 months and it's been good. I loved the place, the apartment, the location. However, yesterday, I became absolutely terrified when I received a knock on my door at 3 a.m. I live on the top floor of a 25-floor building and was the first to move in after the renovations, so there's only 4 to 5 people on my whole floor. I'd had no texts and no calls from anyone I knew about coming over. First they knocked, I was silent. Then they knocked again, and it sounded like a man knocking. I called my mum telling her what was going on, and that I was utterly terrified, being a young woman, and as I did, they'd waited, then knocked again. My mum called the police for me, and 2 women officers came up. I told them what had happened, and they were really kind about the situation. The only person who I could have maybe expected to knock is the only person who had access, the doorman. This doorman in particular had always had a very strange vibe. He never talked much, but he was always watching me. I'd go to the elevators and he'd get out of his chair to stare at me, waiting for them to open. He is a 28 to 30-year-old, I'm not sure exactly how old, and a pretty tall African-American man. He'd always check me out, and while he wouldn't say much, he'd flirt with me. Now 2 days ago I was going out with some girlfriends, and I was dressed in a tight and short black dress with black boots. He seemed really interested in me at that point and definitely spent extra time staring at me, but I didn't really think much of it. So after talking to the police, I went downstairs and asked the doorman, "Hey, so I got a knock on my door at 3 a.m. Was that you by any chance?" Immediately he said, "Yeah, it was." "Why were you knocking at my door at 3 a.m?" I asked. "Well, it wasn't 3 a.m, it was more like 2:30. I was just checking on you." "Why?" I said, bewildered, and he mumbled something under his breath. I asked what he had just said, and he replied, saying he didn't know. I gave him some leeway and said, "Because you thought I wasn't okay?" Yeah, he said. "Why wouldn't you think I was okay?" "I don't know." I told him that it had really scared me, and I also mentioned that I saw him 3 to 4 times a day. Why couldn't he have just spoken to me down here? "I don't know," he repeated. Looking back, I'd also received a knock on my door at 12:30, but it was very faint, enough where I thought he was knocking on someone else's door. It was so weird. After I told him to not knock on my door again, he called me and left a voicemail on my phone. I noticed the random number and realized he'd called me at midnight and at 3 a.m. I'm really scared because I live alone, and Ring doorbells aren't allowed in the building unless requested. And also the management company keeps hiring guys like this. The last guy was fired, and I'd ideally like to actually end my lease, even if he gets fired, which he definitely will considering the last guy who wasn't nearly as bad. Him being fired would be good, but he now knows where I live, what car I drive, when I come and go, and also has access to the magnets to get up the elevator. He even asked me a few days ago what my unit number was, so he could come up, like it was premeditated. I'm super scared and hear stories about this all the time. I'm terrified he'll have a maintenance key or something, come into my apartment and hide and wait for me to get home. A young girl was killed by someone who worked in her building. What do you think I should do? I, a female, was 25 at the time, and this was 2008 when I lived with my boyfriend in our hometown. It's a small city that's relatively poor and has some drug problems, as there's not much to do. And one Saturday night, my boyfriend, now husband, was at his friend's house. He said he'd be home around 9, and I was about 2 towns over, which is a 20-minute drive. At the time, we lived in a duplex that used to be a big house. My cousin actually rented the downstairs apartment, and she was kind of loud, so I knew when she was and wasn't home. She wasn't home on this night. The way our street was situated is the backs of the houses were on my street, and the parallel street all faced a narrow alleyway. The driveways were mostly only accessible this way. The downstairs unit had a front porch with a door and side door, and our upstairs unit had the back door, and it was at the top of an outside set of wooden stairs. So I was home watching TV alone when I heard someone coming up the stairs and knocking on the door. It was 8:30 and wouldn't be that unusual for my boyfriend to be home early. Maybe they'd gotten bored playing video games, or he'd just felt like coming home. I usually would unlock the door for him instead of him using his keys, because it was dark and it could be a hassle. So I got up and opened the door to someone who was not my boyfriend. He was a thin man wearing jeans that were too big for him, and a hoodie. He had about 4 teeth and was teetering back and forth. I was so shocked considering I was positive it was my boyfriend coming home, when the guy at the door asked me, "Can I use your phone?" Behind him, down the stairs and in the alley, I could see a big SUV, Ford Explorer type of vehicle, just idling with someone in the driver's seat. I panicked and just said, "Yeah, hold on." Then I shut the door and locked it immediately. I was so shocked that it was a stranger at my door and not my boyfriend, and I hid so he couldn't see me through the front door window. I was frozen. Something was just telling me this was not okay. Then after a few minutes, I heard him begin to walk down the stairs. I went over to the door to thankfully see the car drive away down the alley. I called my boyfriend and told him what had happened, and he said he'd come straight home. Once he got there, I calmed down and honestly felt silly. Why not just lend him the phone? Was it really that weird? But then I thought about it more over the next few days. It was 2018. This guy and whoever was driving, and between them, neither of them had a phone. And it wasn't like they were having car trouble. What would they want a stranger's phone for? They also went down an alley and to the backside of a house up some stairs to ask for a phone. They didn't go to my cousin's front door downstairs. I would have heard someone on the porch. They didn't go to any other house, and I saw them leave the street entirely. Also, why go to a house to ask for a phone when there was no car in the driveway? And of course, our battery-powered security camera was dead at the time. I genuinely am not sure what they wanted. If anyone has any idea or thinks I'm overthinking it, let me know. But creepy guy at my door, let's not meet again. It was summer break, and we, my family, didn't go on any trip, unlike every break. I was just 8 years old, and my younger sister was 3, and we were playing along with other kids who lived in the same building as us, just on different floors. The building is not exactly an apartment building. It's more of a multi-storied house. The front gate is a bit further from there, and the only entrance and exit of the building. So, since we were downstairs and playing, anybody who would enter or exit would be visible to us, and we'd greet them because every tenant knows us and we know them, as well as their family members who might visit them. A new person visiting any tenant is rare, but not impossible. Right, adjacent to the big entrance gate is a small, old-style window with a grill, but it has a small opening at the bottom. We were all playing, but then I got tired and sat on one of the chairs placed at the porch-like area, from where the window falls on my right side, and I can see it as well as the gate clearly. I was just looking out when I noticed a man staring at the gate, which looks similar to this. So basically he was able to look at my sister and friends through it. It concerned me when I realized that he wasn't even trying to look away, and just staring at them blankly. So I turned around from where I was sitting to signal my friend to move to the other side away from his sight, which she didn't understand. So frustrated, I turned back and was about to stand up when my gaze fell on the guy, and he was now staring at me. My body froze and I could feel fear creeping up on me. I couldn't move. I don't know why I stared back at him, when suddenly he started smiling, and when I say smiling, I mean full-on grinning from ear to ear. That scared the soul out of me, and I mustered some courage, got up and ran towards my friends. I didn't tell them anything, and just asked them to go upstairs with me, which thankfully they did without question. I didn't tell anything about this to my parents, because I thought they would stop me from going downstairs to play. So the next day we again came to play, and I looked through the window just to make sure he wasn't there. Fortunately he wasn't, or so I thought. 15 minutes in and I spotted him again. He was standing at the very same spot and staring at us. At me. I tried to play it cool because my friends knew nothing about him, but I couldn't for long, and we went back in again. From what I remember, this happened for 3 to 4 days, and now my friends started complaining about how I don't let them play, and that they have to come back earlier than they are supposed to. On the 5th day, or 4th, I don't remember correctly, I made up my mind to not pay any attention to him, and just focus on playing. We were playing cricket that evening, and I was batting. I hit the ball hard, causing it to go over the gate, which was a very normal thing. And as per rules made by us, the one responsible must fetch the ball. My heart started beating because I could see his grin getting wider and creepier. He went towards the ball on the road and picked it up. He then held his hand out, gesturing me to come and take it. I was so scared at this point, but I had to go, so I did. As soon as I reached to take the ball from his hand, he bent down, coming close to my ear, and his words are still ringing clearly in my ears till this day. "I'm a good man. Look at the window when you go inside. I'll leave something for you." This is a rough translation in English. It sounded much worse. That sent shivers down my spine, and I ran with the speed of light. After we were done playing, I saw him sliding a piece of paper from that little opening. He then looked at me, grinned, and waved goodbye. I grabbed the paper and opened it. He had written his phone number and asked me to call him sharp at 2 in the afternoon, and that he knew my parents would be asleep by that time. It was also written that if I don't do it, my friends' lives would be in danger. As an 8-year-old, didn't know any better, so I called him through my mother's phone. He picked up, and I didn't have the courage to say anything, so was silent. But he said, "You're a good girl, just like me. You should come stay with me. Come outside, I'm waiting to pick you up." Now, because I lived upstairs, I went to the balcony, and he was actually standing near the gate, looking directly at me, waving and smiling. I couldn't contain it anymore, so I started crying and disconnected the call. I ran inside and bawled my eyes out in my room. Thankfully, my mother didn't wake up, and I cried it all out. I didn't go out for the next few weeks, and everybody kept asking me about it. I still didn't tell them, though. That guy stopped coming too. I don't remember the time he stopped, but he did, and I was relieved. And eventually this experience started fading, and I grew up. Fast forward 10 years. I was 18, and my mother asked me to buy some snacks. I took my sister and went out, and the shop I had to go to was at the end of the road, several houses away, so not too far. I was standing in a queue when I felt uncomfortable because of the man standing behind me, and because he kept pushing me. Annoyed, I looked at him only to realize it was the same man. My face went pale and I could feel my heart throbbing in my throat. I tried not to panic and calmed myself down by telling myself that he couldn't do anything in public. There were tons of people there, and that gave me a sense of security. As soon as my order came, I took out my wallet hastily to pay, but he beat me to it. The owner looked at him weirdly, and then at me, because I was a regular there and he was seeing this man for the first time. I paid for it anyway, and the owner politely asked him to take his money back. I gave the bag to my sister and asked her to go home to inform our mum about a man following us, just in case he attacks, and I'll have a backing, and she would be safe too. Our house is within the vision range of the shop, so I waited for her to get inside, and now it was my turn to go home. As soon as I stepped out, the man followed me and said something like, "You're a beautiful lady now. Let's catch up." I kept walking and walking, but now that we were far from the shop, he started speed walking, and I had to walk faster. I could feel goosebumps all over my body. I started running, and I could see him catching up to my speed when the owner called for him loudly, saying that some of his money was still at the counter and asking him to come back, which gave me enough time to get inside and lock the gate. I haven't seen him since that day, and it's been 2 years. I'm 20 right now, and I hope to never meet him anywhere in the future. I hope I never see him again, and I don't know why it has instilled a paranoia in me, and I dread seeing him when I turn 28. When I finished uni, I moved back home until I found a job. As soon as I could afford to, I set up a profile on the website Spare Room. I was contacted by James, who had a room to rent on the outskirts of the town I worked in. It sounded good, but he wanted to talk on the phone before inviting me to view it. We had a chat one evening, and it turned out we had some things in common. We both enjoyed fitness, particularly swimming, and we were movie buffs. By the end of the call, it had felt like chatting to an old friend, and I was looking forward to meeting him. James didn't specify his age, but I assumed he was in his 20s like me. When I went to view the property, he actually came out of the house next door to greet me. When he introduced himself as James, I was pretty shocked. He was at least 50, dressed quite conservatively, and looked like he was wearing a hairpiece. If he told me on the phone that he was in his early 20s, I wouldn't have questioned it. I went ahead with the viewing, but I'd already decided I didn't want to rent a room from him. I wanted to live with people who were a similar age to me. I was also put off by the house decor, which looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. When I viewed the bedroom, it looked like it was occupied by a young person. There were several pairs of trainers and a games console. James said that the previous tenant, Mark, was moving to London for work. Coincidentally, my name is Mark too. James invited me to sit in the living room after the house tour. I didn't want to be rude, so I did. He explained that he cared for his elderly mother who lived next door. Then he started complimenting my style, saying I looked cool. He proceeded to put his hand on my leg, which made me feel really uncomfortable. When he asked if I was interested in the room, I said I had some other properties to view but would be in touch. I then made my excuses to leave. Everything about him screamed red flag. I just wanted to get out of that house. As soon as I was back in my car, I called my mum to let her know how freaked out I was, and I absolutely would not be living there. James texted me a few days later to ask if I'd thought any more about moving in. I lied and said I'd found somewhere closer to town. I did eventually find something with some other young professionals, which turned out to be great. Some months later, our town was shocked by the news that a man's body had been found in the fields on the outskirts. He was later identified as someone called Mark. I didn't think much of that until I saw a murder suspect was his landlord. James. The same James whose house I'd viewed. I saw him on the news and got instant chills. He was later convicted of Mark's murder. Back when I lived in the rural Midwest, about 10 years ago, I lived in a house right off the highway. My house was right between one town and another, almost right on the county line. It had a big circle driveway, and if you drove onto it, you would be going straight towards our barn. If you curved right, you could pull into our garage, and if you went past the garage, you could circle around in front of the house and pull back out to where you'd started. Our house had 2 large double doors in the front, which we rarely used as we always used the door that was inside the garage. And one night when it was very late, my doorbell rang suddenly. My husband, my 3-year-old daughter and I were all asleep, and it woke me up immediately. I actually thought maybe I'd dreamt it. But it rang again, so I woke my husband up, and he thought I was hearing things, until it rang again. It was very dark outside, but we have a dusk to dawn light, so most of the driveway is pretty lit up. Unfortunately though, you can't really see the front doors, unless you open the door and look out. You can open just one at a time, or you can open them both by using 2 latches that are in the top and the bottom of one of the doors. My husband got up and I followed him, when he decided he was going to open the door. I wanted to call the cops, but because we live on the county line, we knew it was going to be a while before they could get here. Opening the door, there was a girl, maybe early 20s, standing there. She looked normal, except for the fact that she was standing at my door in the middle of the night. I looked past her and her car was pulled into my driveway, just off the road. Not up to the house or not around the circle, and she said she needed to use the phone, as her car battery had died, or something like that, but she's not sure she can get it to start. I told my husband that there's absolutely no way. This is how horror movies start. We offered to call the cops for them, which would have been the county sheriff. She just kept asking it over and over. I wasn't letting her in, and we told her we'd call them, and then she just kind of stomped off. We watched her walk back to the car, which was maybe 50 feet away. I'm a bad judge of distance. But I could see her car, and I could see her, so I called the cops. They said they'd be there as soon as they could, which was 15 minutes, but they didn't sound very concerned at this point. I wasn't really either. I mean, it was just a girl. She probably did have a dead battery. She opened the trunk and no lights came on. Then she rummaged around in the trunk as the driver's side door opened up and out stepped a guy. Then the back passenger door opened and out stepped another guy. They were all rummaging around the trunk with no lights on, and I couldn't hear anything. Couldn't hear them talking and couldn't tell what they were doing. They all then got back in the car. Now at this point maybe 5 minutes had gone by and I was silently praying that the sheriff had put his foot down on the gas and was going to get there quickly. But I knew it was going to be another 10 minutes or so. They just sat there in the car, lights off and not moving. I couldn't see them when they were in the car, but I knew they were there, and I knew they hadn't gotten out of the car and walked past the house, because they would have had to walk right under the dusk to dawn light, so I would have seen them. I think I could see the driver light up a smoke, but that part I wasn't sure about. But then suddenly I saw something, someone, walking towards the car from the right, coming from the direction of the barn. It was a man, and I have no idea who it was. We don't have neighbours for at least a mile, and he was coming from the back of my property, which ended in a creek. He walked under the dusk to dawn light straight to the car and didn't look at the house, just walked to the car and got in the back. The car started up and they slowly backed out of my driveway and headed north. The cops arrived about 10 minutes later, and at this point I was freaking out. They searched around our property but couldn't find anything, and the cops asked us if we'd gotten a license plate, but they were parked too far away, so they told us to call if they came back. Sure, buddy, thanks. My husband got his shotgun from the shop, on our property, and we tried to go back to sleep. They never came back. I don't know who those people were, and I don't know what they wanted. But creepy people in a car without a dead battery. Let's never ever meet again. I was in second period math class one day with my 4 other friends, and for privacy reasons I'm calling them L, S and J, who were all females, and Z, who was a male. We had a very chilled and laid-back teacher who said that as long as you finished your work on time, you can relax for the rest of the class. But today we felt like working out in the hall. In a way I felt like my teacher knew we wouldn't do anything if we'd gone outside of the classroom, but she let us out anyway, and little did my friends and I know that we were about to experience something that would scar us for life. Now before you ask, we live in an area in the south, and crazy stuff happens a lot there, more than most places. While my friends and I were talking, I had an odd feeling come over me, one I had never had before, like someone was watching me. "Hey guys, do you feel that?" I asked with a shake in my voice, and my stomach was turning. This was weird for me because I barely got scared at all. I just couldn't shake this feeling of dread. "I do. Could any staff be out there?" Z asked, looking oddly concerned. It was odd. I've always gotten used to his cheery class clown personality, and I had never seen him like this before. "Why the hell would they be outside? It's pouring out there and it's almost pitch black," I replied. My friends and I all glanced anxiously towards the glass exit door, to hear a slight scurrying where the dumpster was. But it was too loud and heavy to be an animal, because it's not like we have bears nearby. Then just as fast as the sound begun, it stopped, and we saw a tall man run in front of our eyes and past the glass door. I froze and actually felt like vomiting. Elle was about to tear up in pure anguish and fear, and I saw it in all of our eyes. We would have thought it was one of our teachers, but all of the teachers in our school are female except my coach. But that man was too short to be him. I was shaking uncontrollably, so I said with my heart in my throat, "I'm going to get the recourse officer. Jay, could you come with me?" She agreed and we ran away to get him. We went to his office and told him what had happened. We returned within a couple of minutes, and when we came back, my friends Z, L and S were as pale as ghosts. They explained that they'd seen him running back and forth in front of the glass and was tapping on it again and again. The officer didn't find anything, and he looked at us like we were all mad. So we just decided to keep working to keep our minds off of it. But just then we all heard something that will echo in our minds forever. 2 taps on the window. We all glanced over to see the man that I'd never seen before glancing at us. His disgusting face. Z opened his mouth to shout something, but nothing came out. Then I saw this man mouth the words, "Let me in." Jay then pointed at the man's back pocket and I saw it. A kitchen knife blade. We all rushed back inside and started banging on the door. I was the last one to go in, but I saw him again crouched in the nearby woods. After we told my teacher, we went into lockout, which is when you can't leave the classroom, not a lockdown. My friends and I all still talk about it now, but Elle doesn't like to. We tried to block it out, but we just couldn't, so we just don't talk about it at all anymore. Now my story is set when I was in middle school, and my teacher was absent one day. The gym coach was substituting for him that day, and I'd seen him around the school, and he'd also substituted for us a few times before. I was sitting at my desk talking to my friend who was behind me and was pretending to do my work. For some reason though, he decided to walk around the room to check if we were doing the assignment that was set for us. Because of this, I turned to my desk and started writing, and he went one by one passing everyone's desk, but slowed down once he'd reached mine. He hovered over me, staring down at my work, and I got nervous as I didn't want him calling me out. But for some reason I felt his breath on me heavily, which was grossing me out to say the least. He was a frail and old-looking man, so I didn't think much more of it. He walked really slowly then and seemed harmless enough, but was very passive-aggressive when he spoke to us. I'd always get this weird creepy vibe from him, but always thought it was just me. However, a few months went by and the rumour of him being fired circled around the school. I was curious, so I'd asked around to know what the tea was. Apparently, the same teacher that would sub for my class had been fired. Apparently, he'd been caught trying to touch the girls during practice and throughout gym periods. He touched a girl and it was soon reported by the student. He'd even gotten caught hiding in the crack of the door so he could watch the girls change in the locker room. Finally, he got caught while doing so and was soon fired and kicked out of the school. The news made it everywhere, even on the local news. It spread like wildfire. Thinking back on it now gives me chills to think that he'd watch girls change, and thank goodness he got caught. You never know people's intentions. This first started happening 15 years ago and would take place over the next 13 years of my life. It all started in the summer about 4 months after we'd moved to a new house in a different state. I was 9 years old at the time, and I didn't really have any friends in the area. One day I was out in the front yard helping my dad with yard work. He would mow the front and back yards, and I would either pick dandelions out of the ground or water the plants at the front of the house. Not super helpful, I know, but I was 9 and wasn't allowed to do anything with the lawnmower besides maybe pull the cord to start the motor. My dad had just finished the front yard and had moved his way to the backyard, while I stayed in the front yard to finish up. I remember seeing a package on the porch in front of our door, and going to pick it up. That's when I turned round and saw him. A man in his late 30s, with long dark hair tied in a ponytail, hanging down past his shoulders, wearing a plain white t-shirt, black pajama pants, and no socks or shoes. He was standing at the end of our street, standing with his arms crossed and staring directly at me. Now for context, my house is 4 houses down from the end of the street. At the end there is a road that forms a T-shaped intersection, and on the other side of this, from my house, there are 3 houses, with one lined up with the middle of my street and the other 2 sitting to the right of it. To the left of the house lined up with my street is an old steel treating factory that's surrounded by houses in our neighbourhood, and at that time was still active 24/7. This man was standing in front of the house lined up with my street, at the top of the T-shaped intersection. He was standing right off the edge of the street and in front of what I assumed was his house, just staring at me. As soon as I saw him, I immediately froze and stared back at him, with a sudden uneasy feeling washing over me. The longer I looked at him, the more red flags I began to notice. To my 9-year-old mind, this man was dressed very strangely, and that had already been an immediate red flag. But the creepiest thing that stood out to me was his face. He had absolutely no expression of any kind. There was just this intense, piercing stare with him looking directly at me. It felt like he was staring right through me, and for at least 2 minutes we stared at each other, never looking away or even blinking. Eventually the uneasy feeling built up enough for me to slowly walk myself down off the porch and over to the side of our house, never looking away from the man. When I made it out of sight, I ran to the backyard to tell my dad about what had just happened. I came up to him as he finished mowing the backyard and described what I had seen, and that was when he told me that he had seen this man the other day doing the same thing, except just staring straight down our street. He had his arms crossed, plain white t-shirt, pajama pants, no shoes, just like when I had seen him. After that, my dad told me that he thought the man seemed off, and to stay far, far away from him. Unfortunately, that would not be the last time that I saw the man at the end of our street. From that point on, I would see him much more often. I would be riding in the car with my family, or outside doing something in our yard or on the block, and I would look over and see him standing in the same spot, arms crossed, intensely staring. He wasn't there 24/7, but at least 3 days a week I would see him outside, sometimes for 5 or more hours at a time. If not staring at me, he'd be staring at someone walking their dog or a car passing by. Once I tried to figure out his schedule so I wouldn't have to be around him as much, but it felt too creepy keeping track of him, because he would occasionally start scanning his head around looking for people to lock onto, which really creeped me out. Now some of you may be thinking, he's just staring and not doing anything, that's not that bad. Well, sadly, I would later find out that things were far worse than I had ever imagined. Fast forward about 9 years, I'm now 18 years old and looking to get a job to save up for my first car. I hadn't really been able to save any money up to that point, and my parents weren't in any position to be able to help me with purchasing one, so I knew that I had to try and find a job that would be easy for me to get to and that would pay me enough to hopefully get a cheap car quickly. Lo and behold, the steel treating factory next to the creepy man's house has a now hiring sign out front, and I decide that a 2-minute walk to work had to be worth it, even if it meant walking by creepy man's house. I had seen this guy doing this routine for almost a decade at this point, and figured that it wasn't going to be a problem. So I applied and ended up getting the job. It was hard work, which usually consisted of heavy physical labour and keeping up a constant pace, but nothing I hadn't expected. I started off fairly slowly, but ended up getting much better and able to do tasks much faster. About 3 months in, I was assigned to work on a machine that I had not previously worked on, located in the loading dock. From the loading dock, I had a clear view of the wooden fence that separated the factory loading zone from the creepy man's house, as well as the front of his driveway, where he would normally stand. I couldn't see the man standing at his post, but I was able to notice a large pole in the fence, which seemed like it had been made in some kind of accident. The fence was not broken cleanly, but there were splinters and cracks in it where the hole had been made. I asked the floor worker who was with me at the dock, let's call him Ronnie, if he knew anything about this, and this actually got us into a longer conversation about the creepy man. Ronnie had been with the steel treating factory for over 15 years, and had seen the man during his staring routine more than once. According to Ronnie, the hole in the fence had been made by Creepy Man, and he had told the managers of the plant that it had been an accident with his truck. But that's not all. Ronnie then went on to tell me that creepy neighbour guy actually runs a daycare out of his house, and that it was an unregistered business, and has actually led to police being called on him more than once. This surprised me, as I had never seen the police over at his house before, but after Ronnie told me this, something else occurred to me. When looking at Creepy Man's house, whenever his van wasn't sitting in the driveway, you could see one of those children's mini playgrounds with a slide and toys built into it, the kind toddlers would play with. This always struck me as odd, because never once in those 9 years up to that point had I ever seen anybody else come or go from his house, especially not any children. But I had never really dedicated much thought into it. After Ronnie told me this, I thought back to when I had first seen him as a 9-year-old, and all the other times he had stared at me growing up, and I began to wonder if he had been secretly plotting to try and get me over to his unofficial daycare. Sadly, I couldn't really confirm what Ronnie had told me, and at this point I had been dealing with my own personal problems at home, and so I just filed the story into the back of my head as something I would not at all be surprised to find out was true. I left that job not long after this. I had saved up the money I needed for a car and was able to make my way into the career field I had been hoping to make it into. Fast forward to 3 years later, and to one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me, and the reason for my posting this. At this point I had moved away from home, but ended up having to move back home with my parents for reasons I'm not going to get into. I had also met my girlfriend, and we would spend some nights driving over to my parents' house to watch old movies or play games with my janky basement setup. By this point, my girlfriend was aware of the creepy man, but paid him as much mind as anybody else. As creepy as he wasn't breaking the law by standing there, and our lives already had too much going on for us to be focusing our time and attention on his weirdness. On this night, I was driving home with my girlfriend for a normal night of watching movies. I didn't want to block my mother's car in on our single-lane driveway, so I had recently started parking in the grass patch behind our house. Now, behind our house was an alley that ran past everybody's backyards. Our backyard had a wooden fence up against the alley, with a separate garage building which opened up into the alley. I had started to park in the grass patch area, in between the garage doors and the alley more often, and so that was the direction I had been driving home, silently hoping to myself that the creepy man wouldn't be outside on a pleasant night like this. Well, of course, I had jinxed it, and the way home that I was going ended up taking us right past him, standing and staring us down. I locked eyes with him very briefly as we drove past, and headed to the right side of the T intersection to turn into the alley to go behind my house. But here's where things got scary. For some reason, I don't know why, as we passed by the creepy man, I got a really bad feeling. A feeling very similar to the day I had first seen him. A gut-wrenching, something is wrong kind of feeling. And so I decided to look in my driver's side mirror, and to my horror, the creepy man had actually left his post and started walking quickly in my direction. I can honestly say that this was the first time I had ever seen the creepy man not standing completely still, and here he was walking the same direction I had gone. As my thoughts started racing, I turned into the alleyway and then went 4 houses down, turning into the grass patch behind the garage in our backyard. I immediately told my girlfriend what I had seen and how strange it was. I did not want to freak her out, but I didn't want her to get blindsided if something bad was about to happen. From the angle that my car was parked, I could turn around in my driver's seat and stare at the alleyway through the slits in the wooden fence in our backyard. I would be able to see if he was coming and see if he rounded the corner. I locked my car doors, turned in my seat and reached into my pocket to tightly grip my pocket knife. My eyes widened and my heart started beating fast as I saw him casually walking down the alley through the slits, right up to the edge of the wooden fence, and then pause. After a few moments, he turned around 180 degrees and started walking back down the alley in the direction he had come from. I waited about 2 minutes before getting out of my car and slowly approaching the edge of the fence, then walking into the alley to see that he was gone. I have thought about this quite a bit since it happened 2 years ago. I don't actually know if he recognized me or the house that I had pulled into, or why he chose that night to follow me and my girlfriend and scare the hell out of us. Honestly, I don't really care. I was able to move out of that house shortly after that happened, and I'm now living with my girlfriend, who today is my fiancé. But to the man that stared at me and my entire neighborhood for over half my life, and who followed me and my girlfriend into a dark alley for God knows what reason, I don't ever want to encounter you again. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the stories in this episode. Please let me know what your views are, and hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, keep being creepy.